Hello, folks, and welcome to episode 10 of the Prospectus series. So, this episode, we're going to be looking at entomology. So, I'm going to go through in this section what entomology is, what type of career outcomes you can be looking at, some of the finer elements of the subject, equally, where you can study it as a whole rounded point in terms of which universities currently explore a specific entomology route at undergraduate level, and as well as exploring this as an entomology specific video where you can potentially look at exploring and specializing in, say, your further education in terms of higher qualifications such as master's level qualifications. So, on top of that, after discussing different careers, then if anyone has any questions, please put it in the comments below. Okay, folks, so what is entomology? So, entomology is the study of insects within the zoological collections module or zoology subject. So, it's a sub-branch of zoology, which is the categorization of different animal species. So, if you're particularly interested and particularly passionate about studying different zoo animals, then this gives you both a solid foundation in the wider zoology subject, but not only a solid foundation of zoology, but a more specific foundation of insects in general. So, if you are someone who's particularly interested in animals such as the honeybee and might be looking at how to save and safeguard the honeybee population and how to understand that species, then this is the subject for you because it gives you a more rounded focus in the insect field. So, particularly going to be important for those who are looking at apiary, which is the study of bees, or if you're interested in other species such as flies, arachnids, and other insects that might be a particular focus for yourself. So, whilst it's not specifically a department in itself, entomology does cover a wide variety of fields, not only specifically in the zoology realm, it also covers areas such as epidemiology and the understanding of how insects may spread or may move diseases. So, the understanding that interaction with disease science under epidemiology is particularly important. Same as in agriculture, the understanding of how they affect crops, how they pollinate. So, understanding these particular elements of insect biology and insect behavior can go into a wider shaping of your understanding of a particular subject or a particular career pathway. So, in terms of who this degree is for, so many individuals who go onto entomology degrees or entomology pathways are those who have a specific interest in the study of insects. It could be one insect, it could be multiple insects. So, it's really for those who are interested in studying a multitude of species and a multitude of animals, but focusing on a particular type of animal. So, in terms of what areas that you might be interested in, if you're interested in the production of honey, as an example, then the study of apiary, honeybees, and how honey production works, how bees as a species are so essential for pollination, how important they are for particular crops that we grow and use, such as avocados, oilseed rape, and equally some conservationists are looking at the effects of particularly harmful pesticides and seed mixes, which can have a direct damaging impact on bees. So you might be interested in safeguarding the bee rather than using the bee, but it gives you more of a wider understanding of how those animals interact with their environment and what effect we can have on their survival and their population. So equally, it's relatively new as a subject, so there are certain areas that are likely to grow from the entomology field, such as there are a lot of companies that are starting to look at whether or not we can use insect farming as the next sustainable superfood, for lack of a better term. So there are multiple protein powders which use crickets as an example in their production. So they will use crickets as the main protein ingredient because it's very high in protein content, and that can be a new provision. You might be interested in looking at that type of more sustainable food production if that's an area of interest for you. Equally, you might be looking at how do mosquitoes, for example, what is their contribution to particular diseases such as malaria? How does control of that population or manipulation of that population affect, or could it stem malaria in certain trials, such as certain elements that they've tried to do in studies where they've tried to remove certain genes from wild populations and really looking at how that affects that animal. So that's really main things it's going to be an area of interest for, but there are other areas that you can certainly explore in the field. And like I say, as it's a new field, this is something that you could be looking into and growing in, and potentially offering new courses to new students and to emerging markets that we haven't even explored as of yet. So next thing that you need to really understand is what an insect is. So an insect, what you've got to take into account is it's got an exoskeleton, that's a skeleton on the outside of its body, and also that generally speaking, insects fall into a category which is common to all arthropods. So all arthropods have exoskeletons. All arthropods generally will have at least 6 legs, but some species will also have more than 6 legs. So your arachnid species and certain types of crustaceans will sometimes have more than six limbs. So the other thing that you need to take into account is generally insects are split, their bodies are split into more sectional design, so they'll have clear abdomens, clear heads, thoraxes. Some will have wings, some won't have wings, some will have hidden wings. So you'll have, these can vary from anything from the ladybird to species like your butterfly, or certain crustaceans like your crabs, your lobsters. Some of these certain species will have more enlarged parts of their anatomy, such as certain species of crab will have one particular larger limb, and some species will have more uniformity. Some insects will also be able to fly. Some insects are unable to fly. Some are terrestrial. Some are arboreal. But the main categorization that you've got with insects as a whole is they will have clear sections to their body, they have an exoskeleton, and they have at least 6 legs. So in terms of insects as a wider interest, think about particularly certain insects which are your environmental indicators. So these are your species which are going to be most severely impacted by sudden change in the environment. So temperature increasing, temperature decreasing, flooding, droughts. Certain environmental indicators are going to have a more profound effect on both mammals and birds, but they'll affect the insect population first. So if you can recognize more gradual changes in the insect population, such as their reproductive rates, you can potentially act before it affects the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, and so on. So your environmental indicators species, so that might be, for example, crops are going to be adversely affected if bees as a species start to go into a more severe decline. They're already critically endangered, but if bees as a population are more adversely affected, then that is going to be a potential problem, and we've got to be able to track and identify what these changes are and how this is going to affect both our population and their population. So for archaeology, a lot of traits that have been observed in insects, you can see certain changes in the environment, same as you would in mammals, certain adaptations, but equally from an archaeology point of view, certain points of view, especially in certain cultures, certain insects are more significant. They are used in different interpretations, and equally, you can sometimes tell cultural relevance of certain species that have been used in society, so such as Japanese silkworms, and you can also see species such as scarab beetles being used in Egyptian culture. So forensics, there are certain specific types of entomologists who will use insects as a form of identifying different forms of ages of cadavers, or they can be used to identify how long a particular crime scene has been active for. If there's a sign of insect life, a lot of insects will eat. They're an essential part of the decomposition cycle, and so, for example, if you have a certain new food source for some of these species, some of these species will give an indication to how long that body or that food source has been there for, and will be able to evidence to someone who studies their life cycle, studies their population, what type of indicator, how long it's been there for, what they should take a note of, to more put an accurate date on when that food source was introduced to their environment. In terms of medicine, so insects have both had a long-term and a more short-term impact on the medical field. So, for example, with the short-term impact, medicine has had a severe effect of using insects for more medical research. So that can be looking at very fast-moving life cycles of animals, by editing or using them in gene testing to identify if those animals can react or how they react to certain chemicals or certain compounds, by tracking that fast-moving life cycle at very initial stages of drug testing or clinical trials. So, in terms of earlier uses, and earlier use that is still quite a common use, you have the leech. The leech can still be used for blood poisoning. They can still be used to help break down certain damaging components in the blood of a host, and they still do get used. Equally, on the less colourful topic, maggots can also be used to help stem the breakdown of dead flesh, and maggots will be used in some studies to help rectify this in a controlled setting and then get removed once they have done their job, and they are often then disposed of as clinical waste. So in terms of universities, Harper Adams is realistically the only degree which has entomology specifically listed on their field of study. So zoology with entomology is the degree, similar to Banger's zoology with herpetology specialism. Harper Adams has a specialism offering in entomology. So it's not specific to entomology. As a result, it's not going to be a complete study of insects. There will be some generalization between study of insects and the study of the wider zoological subject, but certain techniques are going to be able to be applied across both the zoology discipline and the entomology discipline. So things that you have to bear in mind are conservation work, lab work, and field study. They will take into account not only the zoo field, but they'll also take into account the study of insects in that specific area as well. So this is something that is very worth looking at and very worth exploring. So other aspects to bear in mind, the university publicly advertises that it's not just examining the animal's behavior, but it's examining the animal's environment, it's examining the animal in the field. So not just lab-based work, but field work as well, and the field work is going to be a main staple of what they're offering you in this degree. So rather than tell you in terms of the modules, what modules are taught across the entirety of zoology with entomology, I've just picked out the key modules which are directly linked to your interest in entomology. So first of all, it starts off with, in year one, you have your environmental survey technologies and field skills. So this is more looking at being out in the field, sampling those insects, working in both rivers, the soil, and in some cases sampling some more arboreal insects from trees and hedgerows to identify what population of animal is in that environment. So it's teaching you those survey techniques, teaching you where to sample, how to do cross sections of that environment. For those of you who are doing the level 3 wildlife module, that is something that you will be looking at in that particular subject, but it's to give you a more deeper analysis and deeper understanding of that topic at a more university level. So moving in swiftly to year 2 is an introduction to entomology. So this is really your first solid undertaking of the study of insects as a science. So that will give you a more rounded knowledge of what an insect is, what the field of study does, why you should be interested in it, what kind of fields you can go into, and giving you more of a rounded picture of what an entomologist does as a whole. So then you move into insect life history. So that is an understanding of the adaptive biology of those insect species. So that will be, generally speaking, it will take certain particular species and focus the study on those more well-known species. So at this point, I very much doubt it's going to go into the specifics of fringe species, but it may well focus on some more key indicator species, as well as focusing specifically on some animals that are particularly topics of particularly talking points for that animal. So that this might be, in terms of particular talking points, you might have mosquitoes, as I've mentioned, honeybees, tarantulas, arachnids. You might also be looking at certain ant species, which are both particularly relevant in terms of field studies for both construction. Termites as well for construction have been used and explored of as a research field before, and also looking at the different strategies that some of these animals employ. So termites, as I've just said, in terms of how they construct their mounds, certain species of Amazonian ant where they bind together and use it themselves as a flotation device for the wider colony. How insects such as the honeybee do a waggle dance to really attract their fellow drones to be able to identify what particular routes to flowers they should take. And equally understanding deeper knowledges or deeper understandings of certain animals that are less favorable in society, so such as why it's important that we still have the common fly and horse flies as an example, and why we have the wasp and what the wasp's wider purpose in the ecosystems are. Then you go into year 3 at Harper Adams, which is a placement year, which I strongly recommend, as I do in all my videos, that taking a gap year is so important, but taking an industrial-based gap year is critical. It gives you the chance to explore your career, explore the wider field at large, and also in vast majority of cases offers you a chance of paid employment in your field, in your specialty, and gives you an idea of where you can go after university. After your placement, you come into year 4, which looks at insect conservation, which looks at particular species which are at risk and how to conserve them as a whole, and looking at what techniques have been employed, how you are going to protect and safeguard that animal as you would any other animal species, and what techniques are being employed by current entomologists worldwide. Then moving into a more, what would seem like a more opposing view, which is your invertebrate pests. So really identifying certain species which are a problem for farmers or a farmer for society as a whole. So animals such as wasps and flies, and how you potentially use those species or remove those species from certain residential. So more of a shorter one now is your work and careers. So in terms of your work and the industries that you want to focus into, big employers such as Butterfly World, Natural History Museum, any zoo who has a insect section, or if you are particularly interested in farming, you may go into the newly emerging insect farming fields. You may go into lab-based roles. You may decide you're going to set up your own beekeeping enterprise and start selling your own natural honey and exploring what it is to be a beekeeper. Or you might go into agricultural management of pests and how to control them. So particularly certain species of insects do pose a challenge to certain agricultural species, such as red mite, which heavily impact the poultry population. So that is one area of study that you can potentially look into, and those are just a small fraction of the careers that you can explore. Thank you for listening. Next video is going to be on what is abbreviated to RALM, which is the Rural Enterprise and Land Management degree route.